We should get started. So thank you everybody for tuning in. Hopefully you're in the right spot. It's Curtin Corner time. And just to welcome you, my name is John Phillimore. I'm the Executive Director of the John Curtin Institute of Public Policy here at Curtin, JCIPP. And if you've never attended a Curtin Corner before, welcome. I know from looking at the list of people who are attending that quite a few of you are repeat visitors, which is great to have. But it's also great to have some new people. So welcome to Curtin Corner. Of course, I'd like to begin by acknowledging the Whadjuk people of the Noongar Nation as the traditional owners of the lands from which we are hosting today's webinar. And of course, wherever you're watching from, on your behalf, I'd like to pay my respects to traditional owners and their elders past and present. JCIPP has been running Curtin Corners on Friday afternoons for almost 20 years, I would say. Speakers from inside and outside the university on a range of topics connected to politics, public policy, broadly defined, and of course today is right smack bang in the middle of that. We do record the sessions and we put them up on our website. So I would urge you to take the time at some stage to look at our past talks and encourage your colleagues to do the same. And if you have people or friends who would like to have seen today but couldn't do it, it probably takes about a week before the presentation goes up on our website and gets uploaded. So I certainly recommend you tell your friends and colleagues to do that. And all this year's presentations are already up on the website. Some of those talks were online. Most of them are online, like today, but some of them are also in person, and those two are up on our website. So I certainly do encourage you to go there. We like to encourage debate and questions. So later, when Quentin's finished his prepared comments, you can ask him a question using our app called Slido. That's Slido. When we sent you the registration this morning, there was some information about how to use that. It's extremely easy to use. You just download the app, which you can do from an app store, and then you go to or you could go to www.slido.com and they'll direct you there. But Slido, Slido, once you're in to Slido, you just enter the event code and start asking questions. The event code for us is very easy. It's JCIPP. So you can submit a question, or you can just like somebody else's question, and I then facilitate the discussion based on the question submitted and how many people have given a tick or a thumbs up to somebody else's question. I've always found it easiest to use my phone for the Slido and to watch the presentation on your computer or your tablet. So now I would like to introduce today's presenter, Quentin Beresford. Quentin has had a very diverse career. He's in academia, in journalism and the public service. He retired as Professor of Politics at Edith Cowan University in 2019, where he worked for more than 25 years, I discovered by looking at it the other day. And prior to that, he worked in the WA Department of Premier and Cabinet. He'd also been a journalist at various times, I think, too. After leaving ECU, Quentin decided to hop over to the other side of Australia and relocated to Queensland just before COVID, from memory. He's now an adjunct professor of politics at the University of the Sunshine Coast. He's the author of many books, more than a dozen books on Australian politics and history. He's been awarded 6 literary prizes for his work. His latest book, or his last book, was Rogue Corporations Inside Australia's Biggest Business Scandals, which was published in 2023. But his new book, Hooked: Inside the Murky World of Australia's Gambling Industry, will be published tomorrow on the 1st of November by New South Publishing. So I highly recommend, after today's talk, you go onto onto a bookstore somewhere online and download it, or go and buy it somewhere. As of tomorrow, you can do that. So Quentin, you've given me a Curtin Corner before, I think, Quentin. So you also are a repeat customer. So thank you very much for agreeing to give this presentation, and we're all looking forward to what you've got to say.
Thanks very much, John. Thanks for the invitation. Yeah, it's great to be back at Curtin Corner, even if only remotely. And thank you too for everybody who's come along to participate in what is, a really important topic. Now, let me cut straight to the chase. The 4 claims I make in this book are: gambling in Australia is a major societal problem. Now, if you haven't been living under a rock for the last 5 years, that's hardly a controversial statement. What I would say is that the multi-dimensional nature of this problem, its political, cultural and economic intertwinings, is probably not that well understood, at least publicly. Now, the problem of gambling in Australia has evolved over 70 years of deregulation, and the book traces that history. And thirdly, state and federal governments are key players in the gambling industry. That is, they've continually aided its expansion and they've turned a blind eye to the consequences. The reason they've done that is that the industry has captured government. In public policy terminology, gambling is a classic case of government capture. Now, we can see the seriousness of the problem in this one graph compiled by the Lancet Public Health Commission in Britain, that Australia has the unenviable reputation of having the largest per head losses from gambling in the world, and at least in terms of those where creditable figures can come from. The total figure is eye-watering. Australians lose $32 billion a year from gambling. Now, the figure of $1,500 per head is a bit misleading in a way, because if you take the non-gambling population out of those figures, you'll get $2,500 to $3,000 per head being lost by every active gambler. And this has been explained in public policy reports as constituting a component of the cost of living crisis in Australia. Now, the era of deregulation begins in the mid-1950s, and the first chapters of the book look at that social history. And I can't go into that in detail, obviously, because that's just too big a task for a talk. But what I need to say is that it began in New South Wales in the 50s by Labor Premier John Cahill, and he did two things. Firstly, he licensed a large number of not-for-profit clubs, and under pressure from those clubs 2 years later, he gave them the exclusive right to poker machines. Now, of course, poker machines, as they were devised in America, you know, in the late 19th century, late 19th century and early 20th century, came with, you know, a warning that they were one-armed bandits. In other words, they were known, even in their early iterations, effectively fleece people. Now, what the Cahill government did as well was it saw an opportunity to tax poker machines to earn revenue for government. And so what you can see there, right from the very beginning of the era of deregulation, you get the rise of big gambling. That is, governments and industry cooperating and developing a relationship to service each of their interests. The other thing that happens in the first iteration of deregulation is that New South Wales clubs become very quickly a very powerful lobby group. Now, you can sit here and say, here we have it. The 1950s tells us the broad story. Big gambling, governments taxing, and social damage being done, all done by a Labor government. And that was the model that effectively was rolled out across the rest of Australia as deregulation took hold. But the interesting thing is New South Wales was the holdout state for 30 years. And other states took a very dim view of what was happening in New South Wales. And this was led specifically by Victorian Premier John Cain. I'm sure many of you remember what a creditable and likeable politician John Cain was. And he was absolutely adamant that poker machines exploited the working class, and he'd have none of it. And he kept it out. He kept poker machines out of New South Wales, across the border. They were proliferating in big RSL clubs and big rugby league clubs, as everybody, I'm sure, has an awareness of those entertainment venues. And of course, West Australia has a very proud history of keeping poker machines out of Western Australia. And of course, it was the John Tonkin government, Labor government, in the early and mid-1970s that took a stand against poker machines in the community. In fact, the Tonkin government set up an inquiry, and members of that inquiry travelled to New South Wales and observed the big rugby leagues and RSL clubs, came to the conclusion that a lot of social damage was being done. There are a lot of welfare issues that were arising out of these clubs, and they took a decision, of course, to keep poker machines out of the community. They ended up in Burswood Casino, as we all know, but they were kept out of the community. And the interesting thing, of course, is everybody in West Australia knows, successive governments maintained that position. And I think that's quite extraordinary politically, given the pressures. And of course, in Queensland, the old moralist Joh Bjelke-Petersen kept poker machines out of Queensland. And so New South Wales was a standalone state, but what happens, of course, is that deregulation becomes the de facto policy across Australia, but it takes some decades to roll out. Now, in the book, I discuss a conceptual approach to trying to understand this whole political phenomenon of deregulation and how it took root and the consequences of it. I won't go into that whole conceptual framework, but I do need to mention the great economist John Maynard Keynes, because he did write about gambling, and I was quite surprised to find this. In addition to rescuing capitalism from the Great Depression, he was concerned about gambling. And he said that the only way you should think about gambling as a public policy issue is that it should be kept frivolous. That is, expenditure on gambling should be minimum, frivolous to a person's total income. And I thought that was interesting because it accepts the reality of gambling. That gambling is an instinctive part of human behaviour. It's been endemic across cultures, across times, across civilizations. So it's a reality. We have to deal with it as a reality. So Keynes is acknowledging that reality. But what he's saying is that if it gets beyond frivolous, it's a problem. And the whole notion of frivolous sort of drew me to the modern conceptualisation of harm minimisation. In other words, if you want to keep it frivolous, you've got to have a harm minimisation policy to underpin gambling. Now, in Australia, what I argue is we've had the exact reverse. We've had a harm maximisation policy towards gambling, forgotten the lessons that Keynes taught us about gambling, and these have represented distinct policy choices by governments. And you can see the evolution of gambling policy in Australia in this graph here, detailing the escalating losses of gambling in Australia. And you note there, back in 1991, it takes off slowly in the early 90s, because two things happened in the early 90s. Firstly, state governments model New South Wales, and ultimately in the early 1990s, 200,000 poker machines find their way into the community. You have to say about this that it's a social experiment inflicted on the Australian community that is followed nowhere else in the world. Every other part of the world, poker machines are more or less, with a few exceptions, limited to casinos. In Australia, we unleash them, 200,000 of them, into the community. So then you can see from the early 90s, gambling expenditure starts to rise. By the mid-1990s, you've got the big casinos being built. Crown South Bank, Star Casino in Sydney, and ultimately there are 14 big casinos built around Australia. You can see from the figures there that they make their own contribution to the escalation of expenditure on gambling. And then you get to 2007-8, you find another escalation because two things are happening. Online gambling begins in earnest. Smartphones come on board. Smartphones, of course, connected to the internet, are a virtual casino in your pocket. And along with them come 30 big international gambling companies to set up in Australia, competing with each other, trying to cannibalise each other's client base. And mass advertising begins of gambling to underpin that business model. So the graph itself is quite illustrative of the various phases of gambling in Australia. Now, in terms of the social problem, I know that's got a busy PowerPoint, but let me just take you through it. The industry peddles this myth, this lie, this piece of propaganda that only 1% of the Australian population will ever be problem gamblers. But that's a very misleading statistic. It's more realistic to compare problem gamblers within the population of gamblers. So roughly in Australia, more or less half the population don't gamble and the other half do gamble at some level. So if you take that population of regular gamblers, how many of them end up in problem gamblers? Now, American research suggests that could be 20%. So it's quite a very high figure. Now, our own Australian Institute of Family Studies did their own survey, and they reckon 40% of the population gamble regularly. Now, the problem with that figure, of course, is that there is a lot of relatively low-level lotto gamblers who you might argue don't cause public policy much of a problem. You can more or less agree with lotto or not, but they don't create much of a public policy problem. So we don't know the number of lotto players who might also be crossover poker machine players or casino players, etc. However, within that residual population of gamblers, the Australian Institute of Family Studies found that half the population of gamblers were already or in the process of experiencing harm. Now, that's obviously a very, very worrying figure. Other Australian researchers, and I draw your attention to Associate Professor Charles Livingstone from Monash University in Victoria, who's a major researcher in this field. His findings, his claim suggests that about a third of regular poker machine players will become addicted. And when you've got hundreds of thousands of poker machine players, clearly that's a major social problem as well. Now, the effects of gambling aren't just felt by the gambler, him or herself. And other research has suggested that problem gamblers will affect at least 6 other individuals, that is, family members, spouses, other relatives, friends, etc., 6 other people close to them. That's when you start to have major problems with divorce, financial stress, bankruptcy, child neglect, child abuse, family breakdown, suicide and crime. The other dimension of the societal problems, of course, is the grooming of children into gambling. I'll say more about that in a minute. Through the mass advertising in Australia of gambling, and what we're seeing, and plenty of researchers have started to document this very well, we've got the widespread onset of teenage gambling. The other dimension of this, of course, is gambling has overtaken sport, which we're all aware of when we sit down to try and watch the footy or the cricket. What that's done is normalise gambling, and the normalisation of gambling is the goal of the gambling industry, to grow the market, and of course you'll get escalating problems as a consequence of that. Let me just take the issue of suicide as one component of this multidimensional societal problem caused by Australia's runaway gambling industry. Estimated that there are about 400 deaths from gambling-induced suicide a year. Now, I've spoken to a number of financial counsellors, and they argue that there is a national gambling suicide epidemic. And they gave evidence on this to the Murky inquiry 2022 into online gambling. And they've done their own survey. There's about 1,300 financial counsellors around Australia. About a quarter of them are specifically working on gambling problems themselves. And of those clients that they're dealing with gambling problems, they reckon that nearly half have talked about or attempted suicide. So this is obviously a major tragic problem that's cropping up in the community that really hasn't been, I mean, this problem of suicide really hasn't been given the gravitas that it clearly deserves. Now, gambling and crime is a massive problem, and the early chapters of the book document how, crime infiltrated the club industry in New South Wales, and how warnings about gambling and crime infiltrated the early inquiries that were set up in the 1980s in New South Wales and Victoria, and were basically ignored. And what we ended up with, of course, are these mega casinos. These are hugely expensive to build, and I'll talk about that with crowd in a minute. And the way in which the gambling industry recouped those costs of building these mega venues is to chase Asian high rollers. Firstly in Southeast Asia, and then more recently in China, as China's economy boomed and it became a haven for billionaires, and China itself has got a major culture of gambling. What we ended up with is gamblers coming to Australia, high roller gamblers, putting millions of dollars down on the tables, who had associations with criminal gangs to launder money. And it's estimated that Crown Casino alone was laundering up to $1 billion or more before the official inquiries called out the ignominy of this whole situation. Of course, no one knows where that money went. It could have gone to, sexual abuse child sexual abuse in Southeast Asia. Could have gone to terrorism. Could have gone anywhere. And of course, money laundering is a very serious criminal offence, and the federal government's got legal obligations to protect vulnerable people from money laundering and turn a blind eye to it. So basically, All this happened under the knowing eye of governments. You know, the licences for Star and Crown and other casinos were regularly renewed, despite the governments knowing that this stuff was going on. And in fact, the Turnbull government offered special visas for high roller Chinese gamblers. And, Andrew Wilkie, the independent member of federal parliament, pinged this in federal parliament. He said that, high rollers arrive in special jets, owned by Crown, roll in, they alight the plane carrying bags, literally bags of suitcases of cash, get through customs, no problems asked, and end up in casinos with money to be laundered. Absolutely shocking, criminal involvement occurring in our casinos. And of course, what we know is that eventually there was a whistleblower in China employed by Crown who cooperated with the 60 Minutes program, 2015, blew the whole whistle on the situation, and we ended up effectively with 5 official inquiries into casinos in Australia. Now, I've read all of that. There's thousands of pages of documentary evidence about how Australia's casinos were deeply infiltrated by a criminal business model. Now, the problem with all of that, of course, is that that's busted the business model of casinos in Australia. And that's a major problem going forward. Okay, so what the book tries to do is explain how we got here. So we've had world-ranking losses. There's $32 billion of losses. We've got escalating social problems, and we've had high levels of criminality. How would you explain this? So the first part of the book looks at the historic underpinnings of this. The second half of the book looks at the more contemporary issues, and that's what I want to focus on. So there's 2 basically short answers as to how we got into this position. One is the political power exercised by the gambling industry. Now, this was known, as I said earlier, the New South Wales Club movement captured New South Wales governments right from the late 1950s when deregulation was first introduced. We know that this was a problem. It was spoken about openly in the political discourse around New South Wales clubs and poker machines, and nothing was done. So the second reason, which I'll go on to, is the predatory business model of the modern gambling industry. Now, I have to have a caveat here. The lawyers would tell me, don't, Quentin, say a blanket statement about predatory business models of gambling. That doesn't involve everybody involved in the gambling industry. So not every bookie operating at a racecourse is necessarily involved in predatory behaviour. Some of the bigger gambling corporations have better reputations than others. So it's not a blanket statement I'm making. What I am saying is that a predatory business model widely underpins the gambling industry in Australia, and that helps explain why we've ended up with these escalating social and political problems. Talking about the power wielded by the industry, we first saw it unleashed federally in 2011 when Andrew Wilkie, who was then standing for the first time for federal parliament in the then seat of Denison in Hobart. Wilkie, of course, was already well known as the whistleblower on the Iraq War. And I interviewed Wilkie for the book, so he's got his story there in detail, and it's a fascinating one. He had no prior involvement in the gambling issue, no heartfelt commitment to it. But the northern suburbs of Hobart, where Denison encompasses, are one of the ground zero regions for gambling damage in Australia. They're just infiltrated. The poker machines are just thick on the ground in the northern suburbs of Hobart. And when Wilkie was stumping the electorate, he was literally looking people in the eye who were telling him horror stories about the damage that poker machines are inflicting on themselves and their families. You just couldn't look away from it. So he became the pokey candidate in that election. And what we know is that election delivered minority government for Gillard and the Labor Party, and there were 4 independents elected. And while they were mulling over who would they support, Oakeshott and Windsor and the rest of them, Bob Catter, Wilkie seized his chance. And he contacted Gillard and he said, yep, I'm happy to come on board, but you've got to promise gambling reform. And they had an official deal that Wilkie would get gambling reform in return for his support for the Gillard government. And the size of the problem there was not well known, but was, was in, official statistics, and that is that there was 600,000, 2011, 600,000 poker machine players. 15% of them were estimated to be problem poker machine gamblers, and they were delivering, those problem gamblers, $15 billion in profits to gambling companies and the clubs movement in Australia. So the political stakes were enormous. Vested interests were powerful, and what Wilkie put up to the Gillard government was two proposals, modest really in terms of the reform that might have been needed, was maximum $1 bets on poker machines, or at least some poker machines designated $1 bets, and mandatory pre-commitment. That was, there'd be a smart card, and a gambler before going into a poker machine venue could set their maximum losses, and after that they couldn't bet any more. And the deal fell apart. Now, I haven't got time to look into the whole politics of how the deal fell apart. There's a chapter in the book about it. It was instructive about the deployment of brute political power by the gambling industry. Basically, in short terms, the gambling industry in Australia at that time, comprising the club industry, the hotel industry, the football codes that were now vested into the gambling industry model, effectively went on the warpath, turned Wilkie's proposal into a culture war, unleashed a massive advertising campaign. James Packer from Crown Resorts was involved in all the lobbying, and eventually the brute power of that campaign, and of course it came on the back of the mining industry's campaign against the Rudd government's resource mining tax. So we had this era where corporations found that they could be major political players by getting into advertising campaigns to really affect public policy in accordance with their interests. And in the end, this campaign was so relentless, so effective. They had a marginal seat campaign targeting vulnerable Labor Party members, and particularly in the western suburbs of Sydney. Basically, the short story was Gillard, who was ambivalent about the whole deal anyway, flew down to Hobart and told Wilkie the whole thing was off, and Wilkie was justifiably irate. He thought he had a watertight deal, and he thought Gillard had reneged on it, and he turned on Gillard, and they became kind of bitter enemies. But the effect of that campaign was twofold, I think. Firstly, it sent out the chill effect. Take on this industry at your peril, it told politicians. But secondly, it put the issue of gambling reform on the national political agenda, and effectively it's never gone away. And there have been two other demonstrations of the brute power of the gambling industry. Again, I haven't got time to go into these in detail, but you can read about them in the book if you're interested. 2018, the then Labor opposition leader in Tasmania, standing against the incumbent Liberal government, came up with the bold policy idea to phase out poker machines in Tasmania following a parliamentary inquiry which collected very shocking evidence about the social damage being caused across Tasmania, particularly in those northern suburbs of Hobart. Federal Hotels has a monopoly of poker machines in Tasmania, and it and the Hotels Association combined to again unleash a major culture war campaign that resulted in Rebecca White losing that election. And a lot of the commentators in Tasmania at that time conceptualised that loss, that the gambling industry had bought that election. 2023, Dominic Perrottet, of course, the Premier of New South Wales, had another tilt at introducing mandatory pre-commitment and suffered the same fate. He lost that election. Now, Perrottet, was New South Wales government, had lots of problems. But again, the chilling effect went out that if you take on gambling reform, you will face a vicious campaign unleashed by the gambling industry. So then you sit back and you think, well, how powerful is this industry? And my take on it is it's very hard to measure in quantitative terms the power of vested interests. But I would say that the gambling industry in Australia is equally powerful or perhaps even more powerful than the mining industry. And it's been likened to the power of the National Rifle Association in America. And the reason is that it's threaded through the entire economy and society. Clubs industry, particularly New South Wales, has 800,000 members. Clubs New South Wales itself is a very, very powerful lobby group. Casinos, we've ended up with 14 casinos in Australia. They employ 30,000 people. They have a big voice. James Packer, of course, was its signature powerful spokesperson. The hotel industry got poker machines, and of course, they ended up producing multi-millionaires who are very influential in the political system. And lo and behold, Coles and Woolworths ended up buying into the poker machine industry, which most people didn't know and weren't aware of. In fact, at one point, Woolworths was among the biggest owners of poker machines in the country. So they're powerful players. You've got the alcohol industry that loves the fact that hotels have been turned into mini casinos where people go and drink as well as gamble. You even have the big banks and the super funds investing in Aristocrat Leisure, which is an absolute darling of the stock exchange because it's the manufacturer of poker machines, not only in Australia and across the world. The owner of that company, the founder of it, Len Ainsworth, is himself a billionaire. And of course, banks paid for the buy-up, the huge buy-ups and agglomerations of hotels by major poker machine owners. And the banks and super funds invested into the hotel industry. And of course, once poker machines went into the community, the big football codes became dependent on poker machine revenue, so they became big players. And then when you reach the online side of the industry from 2007, 2008 onwards, what you've got is a network of power around big international gambling companies, the football codes and other sporting codes, free-to-air TV and streaming services, and they all have a vested interest in the gambling model and obviously present an edifice of power. It's very, very hard for governments. Moving on to the predatory business model, with a caveat that this doesn't explain every gambling operator in the country. Australia, with Aristocrat Leisure making the poker machines, we have the most intensive stroke addictive poker machines in the world. That's been well established. We've mass released these into the community in a way that nowhere else has experienced. They're in football clubs, they're in hotels. I mean, someone sent me an article in the newspaper, the local Noosa Heads newspaper, about the problems of poker machines in surf clubs on the Sunshine Coast. The poker machines are in the surf clubs. But mainly poker machines, and this is part of the whole predatory nature of this industry, are located in low socioeconomic areas. Because the industry knows this, that poker machines are the favoured gambling vehicle of less well-educated people. Middle-class people, better educated people. I mean, I hate to sound elitist about all this, it doesn't come from my values, but it comes from the industry's recognition of the demographics of this. Better educated people who are gamblers prefer casinos, less educated people who are gamblers prefer poker machines, so they're heavily located in lower socioeconomic areas. And casinos are known to exploit problem gamblers. I'll come to that in a minute. And you've got this saturated gambling advertising, 1 million gambling ads a year, spewed out over the airwaves. That's normalised gambling as a harmless form of entertainment, where it's obviously far from that for many, many people. They've taken over sport and they use inducements to keep people gambling. And don't get me started on the greyhound racing industry, because that is an absolute abomination. And there's an inquiry into the greyhound racing industry underway in West Australia, which I'm sure some of you are aware of. There's been a pile of inquiries into greyhound racing and the endemic cruelty in the sport, which I'm sure you're all aware of. Less well aware is that the gambling companies revived greyhound racing, which was a dying sport in the late 1980s, by televising it into hotels and by maximising the broadcasting of a senseless number of greyhound racing venues from across the country. As nobody attends the tracks, they're there for under 30-year-olds out at night in pubs where they can watch greyhound racing and have a bet. And what's known about the greyhound racing industry is that because it's so fast and furious, every race is over in 30 seconds, 45 seconds. It's a really good way to recruit and retain problem gamblers. That's the reason greyhound racing exists now in the modern iteration of it. And it's an endemically cruel sport to the dogs themselves. Now, again, most of you be fairly aware of this, and I won't go into it too much, that, poker machines are addictive. I mean, the industry calls them intense, but effectively what they do is maximise dopamine to the brain. Now, if you want more details on that, the book discusses it. What I think is really interesting is the Diagnostic and Statistical Manual of the Psychiatric Association of America, which is the Bible for the psychiatric profession virtually across the Anglo world, first diagnosed gambling addiction in 1980. And here we are in Australia, we've ignored all that. We've ignored the way poker machines work on the brain, the dopamine effect, the reward system that comes to the brain when you use highly effectively designed poker machines. We ignored all that evidence and rolled 200,000 of them out into the community. Hotels, of course, looking at the predatory model, turned into virtual 24-hour casinos, and what they did was attracted a new clientele, typically cashed-up tradies, young men leaving work, go to the pub, have a drink, and find that there's a whole bunch of gambling opportunities on tap, including, as I mentioned, greyhound racing, but obviously football and all the rest of it. And of course, as we know, these hotels are heavily located, the hotels stacked with poker machines are heavily located in the well-known lower socioeconomic areas of our big cities. And what this represents, I think, is a massive transfer of wealth. So ordinary people are coughing up these eye-watering amounts of money, right, and transferring that to very, very, very wealthy people who own the gambling industry in Australia. Interestingly, poker machine venues in hotels, they're allowed to open till 4 a.m. in the morning. And again, I mean, why do governments allow that? And the reason why they're favoured to open so late is that, your defences, your psychological and emotional defences are low. And the industry knows that's where people are likely to lose lots of money. And I mean, I was struck by realising that the maximum bet you can put on a poker machine in Australia peaked in Victoria at $1,000. They've since reduced it significantly. But in Australia, people were losing far more money on poker machines than was the case, say, in Great Britain. Then we move on to casinos, of course, and I won't go into the whole details of this. You'll be very well aware of it. Jeff Kennett brought in the Crown Casino, put it out to tender. There'd been an inquiry in Victoria that came down against a casino for reasons of criminal infiltration. Anyway, it went ahead. Crown ended up 3 times its initial bid. It cost billions to build. Effectively became the biggest private employer in Victoria, came too big to fail, and as a consequence of the cost of it, it required its own predatory business model to recoup the costs of the construction of it. And so Professor Linda Hancock, 2010, one of the expert gambling researchers in the country, she's a deacon, or was a deacon, 2010 undertook a study and really targeted just how predatory Crown was operating, that their machines were fixed to deliver 1/3 more revenue than poker machines in other non-Crown venues. The Crown was deliberately targeting older gamblers, especially women, they bust them in by the truckload because they could extract from such groups the greatest losses for the least promotion. Staff lacked training to identify problem gamblers, and management really basically created a culture where staff willfully ignored problem gamblers. And Star and Crown Casino really were operating an ask no questions policy on who came into their venues, these plush palatial venues with their gambling money. And it was a profits first culture. Big time known drug dealers were coming into these venues. Drug dealers like a bit of gambling as well as laundering money, no questions asked. There were many, many cases over the years of people who stole millions, ordinary people stealing millions from their employers. Clearly, on any obvious observation, lacked the means for spending millions of dollars at Crown Casino. Ordinary problem gamblers were left to gamble for hours and hours on end without intervention, and self-excluded gamblers who had known psychological gambling addiction problems were allowed to gamble. And the most serious case of that was Harry Kakavakis, who was a Queensland property tycoon, known to have a psychologically addictive gambling behaviour, self-excluded from Crown. Now, the book tells the story of Harry Kakavas and how Crown lured him back. And Kakavas went on to blow $34 million at Crown. Time he lost his shirt and everything else, he was obviously incredibly aggrieved, took his case that Crown had abused his condition to the federal court, became a celebrated case, lost in the federal court, took it to the High Court, lost in the High Court. In other words, the legal profession had not engaged with the psychiatric profession as any mitigating circumstances for Harry's case. And effectively what the courts were saying is that the casinos had a green light to do what they liked with anybody. So who's regulating this culture? Basically, the SAR and Crown were allowed to have a voluntary code of conduct. This was ignored, was not enforced. Government policy was limited in this area to rein in the industry. Gambling regulators got captured, and the financial regulator, ASIC, wasn't chucking the book at anybody. Then we get the online revolution. I'm not going to go too much into detail. We're starting to run out of time, so I'll quickly go through this. Smartphones come on board 2007. As you saw from that initial graph, online gambling ramps up. 30 internationals come and set up in the Northern Territory where regulation is almost non-existent. The online gambling industry is described as a Wild West frontier for gambling in the early 2000s, and online gambling becomes a tool for sport. Now, the tragedy for me as an AFL tragic is that basically the AFL and the NRL have been taken over for the purposes of gambling. That started pretty early, but it ramped up when Matthew Tripp saw, the light on the hill. And he was the owner and founder of Sportsbet, one of the big three gambling companies in Australia. He walked into the office of Lachlan McLaughlin, then Deputy CEO of the AFL, with a deal he couldn't refuse. TAB was the AFL's then partner, and Tripp offered 6 times the price to advertise Sportsbet's gambling products at AFL venues. And Tripp knew exactly what he was doing. He told the media, he was quite open about it all. He told the media that gambling would become the engine beneath the AFL. It's a massive reliance now. If you rip gambling revenue out, they're going to say, hell, what the hell? Well, what the hell are we going to do now? And you get the phenomenon that researchers describe as the gamblification of sport. The AFL's just bedded down in this. What's even worse is that the deals that the AFL does on gambling sponsorship with Sportsbet are structured that they get a cut of every gambling action taken. So the more gambling that occurs, the more the AFL earns, over and above the actual sponsorship amount. So the AFL's incentivised to increase gambling. And so this is what you end up with, ad after ad after ad of the AFL sponsoring gambling. The whole phenomenon of multi-bets is an absolute dud deal for gamblers, but they do it anyway. It's estimated that on the AFL alone, not including the NRL, AFL fans are losing $500 million a year on gambling. The ignominy of all this with the big football codes extends to the TV right deals to broadcast. There's been an arms race in these. They used to be worth millions. They're now worth billions. And this ties the TV stations to the tsunami of gambling ads. About 400 million a year in gambling ads underpin these deals. And what the gambling companies do, they target young men. Young men love to watch sport. But it's known that young men overestimate their capacity to be winners. They're a bit thick at it, a lot of them, unfortunately. They don't really understand odds. I interviewed a professional gambler over all this. He explained it all to me. Basically, young blokes overestimate their capacity to both understand odds and therefore to give themselves half a chance at winning anything. And they normalise the losses by saying, yeah, bug about even, and they just minimise it, cognitively distance themselves from the impact the gambling's had on them. Now, the male market gets saturated, so in recent years, the gambling companies have turned to young women. What we're finding, of course, researchers are right onto this. I know West Australia researcher Mike Daub, of course, has done some very important work around this. He might be here tonight. He might have something to say about it. I won't go into it in detail now. But I was sitting watching SBS the other night and I got gambling ad after gambling ad after gambling ad on the upcoming Spring Carnival in Melbourne. It was being led by female personalities in those ads. So they're all over it. And we're seeing increasing numbers of young women with gambling harm there. That gap graph's pretty clear, showing the escalation of gambling in Australia. What we're doing, of course, it's mostly directed at sport. This is where the ads go. There are some regulations around where gambling companies can show this, but basically we're exposing children both online and on free-to-air and on the streaming service to children, exposing them to gambling. So they'll get about 1 million gambling ads a year on average. And what that is showing up is that children have very high recognition of brand names for gambling companies, and they're getting very subtle education into the gambling culture of odds and, all the whole, culture that goes around gambling. And we're seeing, basically an increasing numbers of teenagers themselves gambling. And of course, when they go to the footy itself, they're exposed to the same tsunami of gambling ads because the AFLs and the NRL have embedded themselves in the gambling business model. I just noticed the other day that Sam Doherty, who's a retired Carlton player, came out and said, he's got a problem. And he's not the first one to come out and say this. There was a survey done a few years ago among NRL players, and they found high levels of gambling among NRL players. It was directed overwhelmingly at horse racing, but what we're doing as a culture in Australia, we are grooming children into young men through gambling ads. Now, a small proportion of these go on to become elite athletes, and when they get into the NRL and the AFL, they've effectively got to be deprogrammed. They've got to have extensive anti-gambling education so they don't breach the integrity of the codes. Now, you might have realised just, I think this week or last week, the NRL in America faced a major scandal of players being involved in fixing games. And I would say it's just an accident waiting to happen in Australia. We've had, instances of it at the lower level in soccer, but you can't have a culture where en masse young people are programmed into gambling as a harmless form of entertainment and expect elite athletes won't end up with a problem with this. So I can't predict, of course, how this might unfold, but if it's happened in the NRL and if we've had early warning signs in soccer, we've got a problem. Okay, here we are at the end. What's happened with all of this? Well, as I've said, there have been attempts by various state governments and Wilkie to take on gambling reform. It's all been slapped down by the relentless political machine of the gambling industry in Australia. It ended up in the Murphy report in 2022. It's a very sad story about Peter Murphy. She was a really dogged, erstwhile, very creditable local Labor member for Dandenong in Victoria. She sadly died of cancer, breast cancer, after this report came out. However, she chaired a very bold inquiry into online gambling in Australia. I spoke to people who were on that committee, and what came out of that committee was a bold bipartisan blueprint for reform of gambling in Australia. And it got in principle support from Peter Dutton, strong, overwhelming public opinion to finally rein this industry in. What happens? Albanese walks away from it. I try to understand, the last chapter of the book tries to understand why Albanese did this. I mean, there's, we call him Albo affectionately, we all know his story, he survived, growing up on welfare with a single mum who was disabled. I mean, it's a very, very, sad and affirming story that someone could come out of that difficult background and ascend to the top of politics in Australia. So, I mean, I'm not there taking the credibility of his story away, but you would think someone growing up in that milieu of working class Australia would actually understand what's going on here, and doesn't. He's just willfully ignored the consequences of this and try and explain that. Well, I do. I try and explain it. That is, he's Labor Party man through and through. He's tribal Labor, and tribal Labor has very strong connections to the gambling industry, through the hotel industry, through the clubs industry in Western Sydney, and to the poker machine industry. There are clubs in Albo's electorate that house poker machines. I think Albanese is representative of a cultural affiliation to gambling that's part of an older generation. It's the dogs and the horses and pokies have all been a bit normalised. It's just working people having a flutter, nothing terribly wrong with it. And basically, such cultural people harbouring such cultural attitudes, just choosing to be ill-informed about how industrialised, how metastasised this industry has become and the dangers that it's posed to the country. And then, of course, there's just the standard transactional politics of Australia in the modern era. $22 million, it's estimated, has gone from the gambling industry into Australia's political parties over recent years. You've got the power of the industry is just so great, as I've tried to explain, and someone like Albanese is just unwilling to expend political capital to deal with it. It's just too difficult. And when Murphy came away and offered him the sort of political gift, not many prime ministers on an intractable problem where you would think the national interest should prevail were given a bipartisan support, a bold agenda already worked out, public support behind him, and in principle agreement from the Labor opposition. You still walk away. That tells you the power of this industry. So where have we ended up? We've ended up with an industry, I argue, that is probably too big to fail, probably too big to regulate, with timid governments represented by our own Prime Minister's inaction. But I'm not that pessimistic. I think if you look behind the obvious politics of it, you can see a parallel story. Gambling has become a big issue with the independents, right? They're not walking away from this. Andrew Wilkie was a lone voice for many years, but they've been joined by the Teals, David Pocock and others, and for them, gambling remains a big issue. And the industry is just one scandal away from raising the imperative to rein it in. Now, shameless plug for my book, all this and more is unpacked in Hooked. Thanks very much.
Brilliant. Thanks very much, Quentin. You can stop sharing. Perfect. You've got us on the screen. That's great. Well, a tour de force. And I'm looking forward to reading the book, which is out tomorrow, as we said. We're already getting some questions on Slido, but if you'd like to ask a question, just download the app, SLIDO, and our code for this event is JCIPP. There's already about 7 or 8 questions there, some of which are comments and some of which are sort of linked, but so let's get stuck straight into it. Someone asked right towards the beginning of your talk about is there a distinction? Like, can we reconcile soft gambling like lotteries, lotto, which contribute to the local community, and raffles, and hard gambling such as horses and event betting? And does the money going into the community, because sometimes that happens with certainly West Australia Lotteries Commission, that sort of does that make the soft gambling good gambling and the other stuff bad gambling? What's the difference, if you like, between those
I
two?
think there is a distinction there. You have to deal with the reality of this. You go back to Keynes. Keynes understood the gambling was instinctive to human behaviour and has been in cultures across time and civilization. So gambling is a part of risk-taking human behaviour. I think his concept of it being frivolous is a really good one to move forward on. That is, when it stops being frivolous, it goes from soft to hard, to use your questioner's distinction, which I think is an interesting one and a useful one. Let's deal with the reality of this. You take on the gambling industry in Australia and you're accused of being a wowser. I'm not opposed to gambling. Who is? It's just there. It's reality. You understand the cultural affiliation of it, but let's tackle the hard end of it. Now, you might argue, lotteries, but I'm not here to advocate for any gambling, but if you wanted to take the reality side of the argument, lotto's mostly pretty harmless. Go and have a lotto ticket once a week. Who cares? $20, doesn't matter. But interestingly, I was in a news agency a couple of weeks ago buying a paper, looked up on the big lotto boards that they have now, and you can buy a lotto ticket for $200 or $300. So even lotto's got into the game of aggregating the risk. But yes, I think that's a useful distinction, and my focus is on what your questioner calls the hard end of gambling. And I think it's a reasonable distinction to have if we lead in on the way Keynes himself conceptualised the industry.
Thanks. I had a question, and someone else also had texted me and asked me if I could ask this question about, you mentioned greyhound racing as being a gateway drug into other types of gambling. But there is also a record of some governments either abolishing greyhound racing or certainly trying to. I think New Zealand's trying to do that. Tassie, ACT, WA's got. New South Wales government tried to. Interestingly enough, it was a Conservative government. Then it got reversed. What's going on with the greyhound industry? Because as you said, nobody goes for the dogs. So what's going on there? Because it seems to be an area where some governments are prepared to actually act. So what's going on?
Look, fascinating. Absolutely fascinating. There's just a public movement for the last, 20 years at least, that has said the greyhound racing industry no longer meets community standards on animal welfare. Greyhound racing was only ever legalised in about 10 or a dozen countries around the world, but its epicentre historically has been in Australia. That's where it found its greatest public support. And all states got into it, and there's about 58 tracks around. There's 2 tracks left in America, 2 greyhound racing tracks left in America, and they're both in West Virginia. And Britain's announced that it's getting out of it. You quite correctly identified that New Zealand's announced a ban. Rockcliffe government in Tasmania's announced a ban. Malinalcus in South Australia held an inquiry and said if the industry doesn't improve its welfare standards, it will go. They just built a couple of years ago this major track in Ipswich, west of Brisbane, that was billed as the safest greyhound racing track in the country. Closed down after 6 months recently because 16 dogs died on the track. This industry is relentlessly cruel to greyhounds. The public increasingly understands that. There's political demands to close down this industry. State governments, bit by bit, piecemeal by piecemeal, are starting to get the story. And I think it's really interesting that the Tasmanian government it's banned in ACT, but Tasmanian is the first state government to ban it. I reckon in 10 years' time it won't exist. The reason why it hangs on, rather than being the dying sport it is from a spectator point of view at tracks, is the gambling industry itself and the big gambling companies. Tabcorp, its media arm, broadcasts 100 greyhound races on a weekend in pubs. They're fast and furious. And that's why it's the gateway industry to gambling, and that's why the big gambling companies will die in a ditch if they can before they'll let state governments push this industry into the dustbin where it belongs. But I think public pressure will eventually force it there.
I mean, just as a sort of a segue to that, from that, is there, if you like, a difference in, we've already got a distinction between soft and hard, but within the hard, you've got things that are, actual physical sporting events, such as, horses and dogs, which in some respects you could argue is like, if you like, for old guys like us. And then you've got the much more the online, sports bet type stuff, which is all, using your phone and your casino in your pocket, as well as the casinos. So, I mean, could the gambling industry sort of survive, or would it be a blow, but just a blip really? If basically we've got the Melbourne Cup coming in next Tuesday, there's lots more discussion about whether horse racing is cruel as well, because horses die occasionally. So, you can imagine horse racing and dogs being sort of to one side, and maybe a dying, or certainly a lowering share of the gambling market, and the real growth area is the online sports bet on the huge sort of football code. So is there a split there, or are they joined at the hip?
You've got to join at the hip a bit, as far as gambling companies can keep that fusion there between the older styles of gambling and the newer forms. But why do we have mass advertising? I mean, why won't the federal government ban advertising? Because gambling industry sees that, as thin end of the wedge to the business model. In other words, through mass advertising, online gambling will find endless iterations to gamble on. So if greyhounds and horses fall over because blokes like us, pass off the gambling mortal coil, there will be more markets. I mean, this is the whole point of the industry. You've got to keep growing it, and you grow it through mass advertising. And what they do is you market gambling to who's going to win Dancing with the Stars, who's going to win the Eurovision Song Conquest. I mean, there's endless iterations that you can present to people. And of course, footy will be there forever. So unless governments change policy to rein in the hard end of the pernicious gambling industry, the predatory underpinnings of it, I don't see anything changing. It'll just evolve in different ways.
Okay, got some other questions here. So Tim Diamond, who great friend of Curtin Corner, hey Tim, says how, I mean, this is relating to your bit about New South Wales Labor sort of being where it all started and being the real sort of epicenter of the whole thing with the leagues, clubs, and all the rest of it. And Tim says, interesting supposition, New South Wales Labor was the only branch that didn't split in the 1950s. Is there a relationship between the Catholic Church power in the New South Wales right and support for gambling? And you could contrast that with your picture of John Cain, good, well-known sort of old Presbyterian teetotaler. So which kept Victoria away from it, but also kept the pubs, got the pubs to shut at 6 o'clock in Victoria for a long time. So is there something about, what is it about New South Wales? Are we talking Rum Rebellion 1802 or something? Or what is it about New South Wales and New South Wales Labor? Is that really the driving force behind the whole political economy, if you like, of the gambling industry?
Specifically, I don't have a deep answer to that question, because it would have taken me down a rabbit hole of historical explanation that I just couldn't go down. But I think he's onto something. I don't, there's any doubt about that. The Catholic Church, of course, as we know, different from the moralist Protestants, always had a very different attitude to gambling. I think that's right. I mean, I don't discuss that in the book because I can't get the historical explanation that deep, because I just don't have the space for it. But I think he's onto something. And of course, one of the things I do briefly describe in the book is the Protestant moral campaign against gambling from the late 19th century to the 1950s. So the Protestants dominating conservative side of politics banned most forms of gambling around Australia other than horses and dogs. And it was the New South Wales Labor government that broke that policy tradition. Now, why did they do it? Why was Cahill such a fan of all this? Look, I mean, the Catholic nature of it may have been one element of it culturally, because Catholics are less problematic about gambling, more focused on sex and prostitution, all the rest of it. But also Cahill did have, and I do discuss this in the book, Cahill had what in his mind was a important social consideration after the war. You got all these returned servicemen coming back. You got pubs around the country locked into 6 o'clock closing. They're all kind of rough drinking dens. Sexes can't mix amicably in a hotel because it's gender divided. Cahill responds to pressure to open up clubs as new entertainment venues, right? So I think there was an edifying part of that public policy. But what happened, of course, no problem about opening up clubs. But once the clubs were open, it took 2 years of lobbying for the government to give them the exclusive use of poker machines. So I think your question is on to one part of the cultural dynamics of it, but there is that second part. Cahill's responding to post-war demands in New South Wales for more forms of entertainment and delivered.
Is there, I mean, there may be other people who would be able to tell us this, I'm sure, because there are gambling researchers out there, but with New South Wales being the state, with the longest history and with widespread poker machines, do they have a worse sort of gambling problem than other states, or alternatively, and someone else asked this, Margot from Curtin says our WA is an outlier because we don't have the poker machines around there. Is there some evidence to show that the WA has lower dollar spent per capita, and does New South Wales have more per capita, or is everyone else caught up with New South Wales apart from us?
Well, look, what you could say is, and the graph I showed you about the escalation expenditure will tell you what goes on. That is, when you bring in a new mass form of gambling accessibility, you will have a higher rates of expenditure and therefore social harm flowing from that. So that's a clear association between accessibility, participation, and from participation, social harm. So that's a pretty ironclad relationship. But specifically in New South Wales, look, I've trailed the evidence on this such that you can get it from the newspapers at the time, and I discussed this in the early chapters of the book. New South Wales very quickly has escalating social problems around poker machines. No data has been collected, so there's no hard figures on the extent of that. It's anecdotal. People were screaming in the newspapers about it. So yes. And secondly, when you get to Crown operating in Victoria, Crown, the cost of Crown was in the billions, and they had to recoup it by creating, through advertising, a gambling culture in Victoria. And it was very successful. And the figures show that Victorians, after Crown opened, escalated their expenditure. So, and you come to Western Australia, and Western Australia without poker machines, the figure that's usually bandied around is that they had 1/3 less problem gamblers in Western Australia because they kept poker machines out. Problem with that, as a continuum, of course, you get online gambling penetrating across the nation. But still, without poker machines, the big problems of poker machines and online, and they create the damage. And so if you keep poker machines out of the community, by obvious fact, you're going to have less social consequences.
In WA's, just interrupting, I mean, like Margot also says, so WA has succeeded in keeping pokies out other than at the casino. Is that basically just a factor of we're rich? WA's got, the state government's got a lot of revenue, but of course this predates the GST issue, of course, but therefore we could afford to, whereas some of these other states were just, they got to get their money from somewhere, so suddenly they're privatising TABs and their lotteries commissions, and they're letting full sort of open slather to the pokies so they can get some money out of them. Obviously there are other issues in terms of there are other costs, but the direct sort of licensing fees and things means they can get some revenue out of it. And WA is rich enough to afford to be moral. Is that the basic?
I don't think there's any hard and fast evidence either way. What we do know is it became part of the political DNA of Western Australia, and that was established by the Tonkin Commission. They collected the evidence. They went to the clubs in New South Wales, observed them, collected what little data existed, but it was mostly observational, and came down very, very strongly that this caused significant social damage and should be kept out of the community. And I just think that entered, and of course, as poker machines rolled on and the stories kept coming out about the damage that was being caused in New South Wales and then in Victoria, I just think the political culture in Western Australia had a bipartisan consensus that this just wasn't a good road to go down. Now, you could argue, but the Western Australian economy always wasn't, buoyant on mining all the time. There's peaks and troughs. So I don't know that it was overwhelmingly, I don't know, is the short answer to your question, but my reasoning would lead me to believe that it becomes an article of political faith in Western Australia for the very reasons that once they stand aside from it, they can see the consequences, and no government's prepared to break the consensus that they should be kept out.
Well, long may that rain. Actually, David says, look, this may sound bonkers. He's never seen a poker machine, not in any pub or sports club or tavern. So do we have them in WA? And the short answer, as far as I know, is outside the casino, the answer is no, correct?
In Western Australia, outside the casino, none in the community.
Right. Okay.
Yeah.
Okay. A couple of other things. Actually, Margot just mentions as one success, Australian Super has recently overhauled their socially aware investment option to now exclude gambling interests, including aristocrat leisure. So,
good on them.
Ethical investing. That's an important.
Yeah. That must be fairly recent. I haven't been aware of that, and that's good because they were backing aristocrat leisure to the hill because aristocrat leisure is just so profitable. I mean, it delivered Len Ainsworth to being a billionaire, let alone all the investors in the company. So if super funds have finally taken that decision, good on them. They should have taken it years ago.
The other thing, of course, which is harking back to the tobacco days about how can sport survive without the sponsorship. So we heard that in the tobacco, all those years ago, Benson and Hedges, whatever it was for
the Willfield Cup.
Yeah, exactly. All those sort of things. We've heard about sports' supposed reliance on the revenue. I mean, they managed to survive. At least there was a bit of a gap between tobacco finishing and gambling taking over. I mean, are the sporting codes pretty much the football code saying the same thing now? So basically, if you took it away now, the whole thing would collapse.
Totally, and that's why I pointed out Matthew Tripp's comments to the media when he offered 6 times Tabcorp's deal in 2014. He knew exactly what was happening. Now that's where government policy has been an absolute failure. These relationships should have been outlawed by legislation when they first arose. And what would have happened, of course, is just when cigarette sponsorship was banned from sports, the AFL and NRFL would have to go and knock on other doors. Toyota, all the rest of it have been involved in sponsoring AFL. There's no reason that ties sport to gambling industries other than the absence of legislation preventing them doing so, like we did with tobacco. So this has just been an absolute abject failure of public policy to regulate. I mean, just look at the contradiction. You can't have sport, which is promoted as from top to grassroots, as a healthy outlet for the community and a very, very good way to bond community and create positive social outcomes, etc., being associated with dangerous products. I mean, that's just a contradiction in the way in which sporting policy should operate in the country. And we finally took 20 years of campaigning, finally kicked tobacco out. Now, critics, supporters would say, well, gambling's not quite like smoking because, no safe level of smoking. And you could argue, you might want to argue, but you could argue that at the soft end we spoke about earlier, there's manageable levels of gambling, therefore the two products aren't the same. I would simply argue that the industry has aggregated itself to such a level of social damage that you can't run that argument anymore, and it should not be promoted through advertising and deals with sporting organisations.
Okay. Well, I think we might leave it there. We've got to about 15:15 already, so there's a lot there. There's a lot more in the book, everybody, if you want to look at it and go. So as of tomorrow, or midnight tonight, who knows? You might be available. I mean, if we're looking at Eastern States times, midnight will be only in a few hours, 4 hours time. But I would highly recommend you get Quentin's book. Quentin, thanks very much for your presentation. It was really good. And of course, we'll put the PowerPoint up and this presentation up on our website soon, so everybody can go back and have a look at it. And please check out the book. So thanks again, Quentin. That was terrific.
Thanks for attending, and thanks for the invitation, John. Appreciate it.
No problem. Now, just letting people know, next week we've got another Curtin Corner. We've got our speaker is Dean Ashenden from University of Melbourne, a long-time observer of Australian schooling, and he'll be talking about whether Australian schooling, or asking whether Australian schooling can be reformed. So please, I hope you can make that next Friday afternoon. It'll again be a webinar, so it'll start at 4 o'clock Perth time. But until then, have a great weekend. Don't forget to buy Quentin's book tomorrow. Okay, good night.